Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's edition of our 75th anniversary Leading Lights interview series, where I talk with leading people from all walks of life on 21st century management and leadership practices. Now, today, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Justine Greening, the Right Honorable Justine Greening, MP, co-founder of the Social Mobility Pledge and Levelling Up Goals, and former Member of Parliament and Secretary of State for Education and Minister for Women and Equalities, among several other ministerial positions that she's also held. Welcome to you, Justine. Delighted to have you with us here today.
Thanks, Anne. Really, I'm exhausted listening to all those roles, actually.
I'm sure the roles themselves were also pretty exhausting, but
they were.
Also very important and obviously made a big difference. And I'm sure in your current roles, you're continuing to make that difference. And of course, at CMI, we like to take a look at what do we need to do about management and leadership going forward in the next 75 years. So one of my first questions is, what do you think the role of values, ethics, and culture is in defining what good management and leadership looks like as we go into the 21st century? And how do you think it should manifest itself?
I actually think it's always been important. I just feel that now it's even more important, and it's more important because for business in particular, I think there is more accountability to a wider world, and obviously having the right values, being mission driven, purpose driven, means that you've actually worked out where you fit in as an organization. And I think leaders need to really have worked that through in their minds, and I think that needs to then show in that wider management style. And certainly, I suppose maybe for me on a personal level, I'm just generally quite a mission-driven person. I like to be really clear on what I'm trying to accomplish. There are things that I really care about that I've always put my time into, and I guess that's why I ended up going into politics. Obviously, I'm not an MP now, but in a sense, that's also why I'm continuing to do so much work on social mobility and purpose, because I just think all of this is crucial for businesses. And I've always seen business in particular as a real force for good. And so that's where I'm marrying all of my interests now. But yeah, I think values, ethics, all of that is absolutely crucial.
Yeah. Now, of course, I've heard you talk about your career, and I know that you did start out in management positions as an accountant, as a chartered accountant, in fact, and kind of worked your way up and then went into politics. If you think about the challenges that you faced at the start of your own management career, what of those challenges still exist, and what advice might you give to those who are facing those kinds of challenges?
I suppose for me, I felt I was one of hundreds of thousands of accountants out there. So there's a big question about how am I going to stand out if I want to get my next career opportunity. I think there was a challenge around getting the right advice. So I'm from a very working class background, and I didn't particularly have a social circle through my family, especially of people that I could particularly ask about careers. And I think that continues to be quite an important thing in your life at an early stage in your career when you're making those first steps. So although I'd gone into being a chartered accountant, I'd trained at Price Waterhouse, then now Price Waterhouse Coopers, obviously. I think it was, how do you work out on navigating your career? And I think maybe one of the challenges as you get further up in your career that I was probably hitting on was this sort of who you know element and network element to how you progress once you're into your career. And I think that's still a challenge now. And in a sense, my social mobility work really is about making sure that although connections and networks obviously matter because they're how you get stuff done, principally it should be about what you know and your potential. That is how you ultimately see doors being open to you. But I guess at the beginning it was really not really knowing what my career path should be. And I think that's still a real challenge for a lot of young people as they make their way in their career.
Sure. And what advice, for those that don't have those family connections that you rightly say shouldn't really be the main reason why somebody gets opportunity. What advice would you give to those people? What did you do that they could benefit and learn from? How did you go about building that network?
So I don't think I was brilliant in a way. I ended up doing an MBA at the London Business School, and I think that was really good for me in terms of docking into a peer group of people at similar stages. Some of them were further ahead, and getting a sense of just how many different roles people had and also what they meant. When I wanted to do the MBA, and I was lucky enough to get sponsored by my then employer, which was SmithKline Beecham. Latterly, we went through the merger, became GSK. I don't think that's why I'd wanted to go on the MBA. I wanted to learn and I wanted to keep developing. But actually, I think that network that it plugged me into of people all thinking through their next career stage ended up being really, really important to me. And I think today, if I was advising people, I'd say try and find people who you are working with and for that can give you some advice, can mentor you. But otherwise, actually today, it is easier to go on the internet and start to find resources that can help you work through your decisions you're making. And certainly for my work on social mobility through the Levelling Up goals, we're really looking now at how we can have all of these businesses and employers we're working with the opportunity to maybe get them more involved in providing those career paths, that pipeline, but also some of that mentoring and advice and careers advice that young people need. So really excited actually about all of that.
That sounds great. So today's challenge is actually leveraging some of the companies that are working with you on the social mobility pledge to offer that kind of mentoring. I think that sounds like a great initiative, and obviously mentoring something we strongly believe in CMI and encourage all of our members to do for the same reason. Now, obviously, you've worked in the public sector, you've worked in the private sector, latterly in the public sector. You've mentioned, we know there's a huge amount of change going on, right? So the rate of change will never be as slow as it is today. We know that. But how do institutions, and whether they're government or private sector organizations or universities, how do we balance between finding the right blend of embracing change, but hanging on to continuity where it matters?
I think you've just got to be smart. I mean, first of all, I think you've got to, as you say, Anne, things will change. They are changing. And I think now change happens faster. I think sometimes employees feel like things never stop changing and there's no time to sort of ever really allow things to bed down. So I think it's about getting the right amount of pace of change in your organization. And I think it starts with being really clear to people who are part of it about what is required, but crucially also why. And certainly for me as a Secretary of State, where I was running massive departments, and so in the case of international development, they weren't even departments that were all based in the UK. We had 30 offices all around the world, and we did quite a significant change program in DFID, but it was really based around culture, values, and clear guidelines, but simple guidelines, because there was no way that you could micromanage what was happening on the ground in some of our development programs day to day. I mean, many of them were in really dangerous places where actually we did need teams on the ground able to think quickly about how they were going to handle situations that came up. There wasn't time for them to revert back to Whitehall. So I think for us with DFID in particular, it was about collectively recognizing the challenges that we needed to change in order to meet, but then going beyond that to have that change. In my mind, in DFID, it was delivered by the whole organization. So we literally had people at every single level really being those champions. So it didn't feel like it was a senior level of the organization doing change to a lower level. I saw it as a really brilliant opportunity for a lot of people to shape how we needed to change as an organization, but also to get the experience of being involved in delivering that change and to be champions for it wherever they were. And the change, incidentally, was all about simplifying guidelines, but crucially allowing staff in very different environments to be much more empowered on the judgments they were making. And it wasn't about devolving responsibility so we could pin something on someone when things went wrong. It was actually about stopping things from going wrong by putting more trust in our employees, but also crucially giving them development so that they could actually really deliver on those roles and learn in those roles as they were getting more important projects to run over time and when they became more senior. So yeah, I really enjoyed doing that. And certainly as I went into the DFE then, an entirely different organization. And in a sense, the control architecture of how you'd stay on top of what was going on was really, really different. At least it was in one country. But there, in a sense, there was I felt much more of a need to really talk about the mission of what we were trying to do, which was equality of opportunity, delivering leveling up through education and that start that every young person gets who, like I did, is going through the state education system. So I think for the DFE and my time there, it was much more about galvanizing them around that common mission. You go to a department like international development, as it was then, everyone was very clear about what they needed to do. It's much more about getting match fit almost to be able to deliver on a complex agenda. So different change programs in different places, but they probably all had common ingredients for success ultimately.
Yeah, there's some great learnings in there that in those examples that you gave. So the importance of engaging the whole organization in the change program, as you did at DFID, the importance of actually making sure that people understand the why of change, right? Not just what it is, but why are you doing it? Giving people more autonomy, more principle-led guidance rather than, a definitive rule book. And then obviously laterally in Department for Education, the importance of purpose, right? Which is again, back to the why. Why are we here? What are we trying to achieve? I think there's some absolutely stellar points there on what makes change programs successful. And when we don't do those, then that's when we often can get into trouble in managing it.
Yeah, and I think people understanding where they fit in. Certainly for the DFE, I literally wanted every single person walking through those doors every day to understand where their role fitted into achieving this equality of opportunity mission that we had. Literally, they should know which bit they were helping to deliver on. And that's, for me, why that was so important, because certainly in those sorts of organizations, there's always a danger where some people think they're in the really important bit, the exciting bit where lots of policy's happening. And the danger is that people who aren't in that and are perhaps part of the more ongoing but crucial delivery part of the organization feel as if, their stuff isn't quite so important, when actually what I was trying to say was all of this is crucial, because unless all of it happens, we can't deliver on what we're trying to do. And I guess the other thing I really focused on for the DFE was making delivery much higher priority and feel to people like it was every bit as important to me as a Secretary of State as the policy agenda was. And again, there are times, certainly in the public sector, if you're a Secretary of State, as I was, where the policy bit feels really sexy and all the officials want to do that. Whereas what I was saying to them was, yeah, I love all the ideas and I'm really passionate about them myself. And there's a lot we can do on shaping how things should change. But fundamentally, it doesn't matter if you have the vision, it doesn't matter if you have the right strategy. If you can't deliver it and implement it, and if it doesn't actually change lives on the ground and deliver that purpose we had of equality of opportunity through education, we failed. And so I really tried to tone up the importance of those roles. And for me, that meant very practically getting those people in to be briefing me. We beefed up to the delivery team. We gave them some, what I felt were key projects in order for me to get under the skin of what was going on the ground, but also crucially to make the point to a wider organisation that this mattered and that it was policy to achieve an end on the ground for people. And we did, little things to me that made a difference was, I always made sure that my office was nowhere near the entrance, so that I was wandering around the business, and in that case, the department, and really visibly around. So I would be in the lift with lots of people every single day and would always ask them how things were going and always initiate those discussions, because I knew, a lot of officials wouldn't ever dare speak to the Secretary of State, which is not very good, I don't think. But actually, the reality is you had to kind of, in every single touch point with your civil servants, create that culture that was open and positive and inclusive, so that they were absolutely feeling like they were in lockstep with everything that we were doing and fundamentally part of it. And that really mattered to me. So I wanted to create departments where people really cared about what they were coming in to do, knew why it mattered, knew why I cared about it very personally, and felt that they were genuinely contributing to something that was important.
Yeah, I think all of that is, it chimes very readily with what we believe at CMI. And actually, I'm reminded about what you said about focusing on delivery. We used to have a saying at P&G, nobody ever sees the strategy, they only ever see the execution, right? So,
Yeah.
It's true that if you don't get that delivery right, it's really hard to make an impact on people's lives. But obviously, you were not only Secretary of State for Education, but you were also the Minister for Women and Equalities. Now, a lot of our 75th anniversary is looking at the persistent inequalities we face among many groups, including women. And I just wanted to ask you, how do we make more progress on this issue? Are you satisfied with the progress? And how do we get greater diversity when it comes to gender and ethnicity in our positions that matter in our society?
I'm not satisfied with the progress at all, actually. I thought that role of Minister and Equalities was hugely important. I think tackling inequalities is hugely important. And it matters because we are just simply not going to be successful as a country unless it's a place where everyone feels they can reach their potential. And people shouldn't be locked out of doing that. Where you get to on the ladder, as it were, how far you want to go, that should be your choice, in a sense, limited by, what you want to put in and get out and all of it, not by a wider way in which the country works. But so I think there's a moral imperative on all of this that is really important, especially in the 21st century. But I also felt that I was never asking organizations and employers to do something that was bad. I mean, frankly, being able to access the whole of the talent pool rather than just half of it in the case of gender, or part of it in terms of other diversity lenses, that's a sensible thing to do. And all of my work now is about working with employers to help them do that better, but also through the wider work on social mobility in particular, just creating a race to the top. And we started this conversation with a discussion about values mattering, and values really matter to this new generation that are coming through. And in a sense, that race to the top happens, but what will also happen is for those, I think that for those employers that don't really care about that stuff and don't share those same sorts of values, or think it's maybe a bit fluffy, they'll just simply find they won't get younger people wanting to put their working lives into that organization. Everybody, I think, I've always wanted to go to work and feel like the role that I'm doing makes a difference. And I think everybody feels like that about work. And so the role of managers, in a sense, and leaders is to make sure that the organizations they have responsibility for can be those places where people genuinely feel they can thrive. And I think that's how those organizations achieve success as well. It's ideas that change the world. But if you're an organization where people feel like they can't even say anything, or they can't contribute everything that they might be able to, then you don't get the most out of them. But everybody loses when that happens.
Yeah, that's very true. And we know from our research that a lot of managers just don't feel comfortable, for example, talking about race or talking about somebody's social background. You mentioned you come from a working class background, but I bet when you were Secretary of State, people didn't want to ask you that, right? So they don't know how to have the conversation. What advice would you give to people? How can managers get comfortable having these conversations about, for example, race or social mobility?
So, just firstly on the gender point as well. So I didn't really talk about that so much. We do need to be careful we don't flatline at this sort of 33% style. My gut instinct is that somehow a third is this plateau point if we're not careful. I saw it in Parliament. If you look at things like the gender pay gap, and if you like representation on more senior levels of company boards and senior management, there's this sense, I feel, and this is why I don't think it's gone, we've made enough progress. I worry, and what I want to say to people watching this is there's a big danger that we think that's enough, and it's not enough. What we were trying to do certainly is achieve gender equality, and that is about 50-50. It's not about a bit more for women and then somehow that's enough for us. So I think, and that's the case for all of this. And in terms of how we shift it, it definitely takes leadership. So I think people who are in those roles really have to run towards some of these challenges. And I know that sometimes almost how to initiate these discussions feels awkward, but you just have to make a start. And I think if your staff and the organization knows this is coming from a genuine place, then actually that does open up a discussion. And certainly from our work, some of the things that I've seen making a difference are things like reverse mentoring, where actually often that can just create that out of the normal dialogue where you can start to get those links between you and very different people from very different backgrounds and start to have those discussions about the practical barriers. But companies can make a difference on all of this, and they should actually, and they need to if they're going to reach into this wider talent pool. And I genuinely think it's a scandal that there's so little, ethnic representation, for example, on the FTSE 100 boards. And when you look at socioeconomic background, all of these things linking together. Often those people who are, say, Black employees may well tend to be from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and those things do tend to go together. So it's not about necessarily just taking them all as if they're individual topics. It's about recognizing that, for people who are starting with less advantage, actually, they often face these multiple different barriers. And we've just got to be mindful of the fact that actually we've got to create organizations that mean they can flourish wherever they're coming from. And often organizations plug those gaps of knowledge, advice, mentoring in order to enable them to do that.
Yeah, and you've touched on this in our previous in your previous answer there, but when it comes to tackling these inequalities, whether it's gender, ethnicity, age, socioeconomic background, disability, there is a school of thought that says you've got to tackle each one individually. They all face different challenges. You've got to measure progress and break it down. There is also a school of thought that says, well, actually, many of those challenges, the vast majority, are common. And if you make progress on, for example, gender, that has a knock-on effect on improving things for people from different ethnic backgrounds. I mean, where are you in terms of how we approach this? Do we break it down? Do we roll it all up? What are your thoughts?
I think it starts with data and measurement. I think you've got to get a handle on what your organization's baseline, where you're starting from is. And I think that also involves getting your business, whatever you're running, all the people who are part of it, comfortable with what you're doing. So we've just begun a big piece of work with a number of our employers on socioeconomic tracking. Sometimes, as you said, Anne, people feel a bit awkward talking about background. And in a way, it's one of the hardest things. If you walk into a boardroom and there's no woman or there's no one from an ethnic minority, you know that. You can see it with your eyes. But actually, I think one of the reasons in particular socioeconomic diversity has been really tough is it's not obvious. And so when I was a Secretary of State and I would turn up at schools to talk to the pupils there, if you ask them where they thought I came from, often they'd have thought I was educated in the private school system. None of them necessarily would have instantly guessed I was comprehensive school educated, just like them, that I was coming from a background just like them, that I'd gone to a school just like theirs. So I think that's why, particularly for socioeconomic diversity, it really is important. And I think certainly for a country that is saying that levelling up, which is basically the way you achieve equality of opportunity, it's about extending opportunities to people who don't have them. But if that's a national challenge and national imperative, then I think any employer probably needs to ask themselves, well, what are we an engine of social mobility? What's our evidence telling us about whether or not we're a place that's recruiting a diverse group of people? And crucially, then, can they not just get in, but get on in our organization? So the data really matters. I think the culture and the leadership matters. And I think then there are clearly, we've seen loads of businesses doing employee groups. They have role models. There's a whole host of things. There's the mentoring, a whole host of things to really drive change. And the mental model that I've often brought to working with a lot of those employers is almost for individuals. There's a question about whether they have the aspiration to get further and do they want to? Can they, in terms of what they know, their knowledge and skills? Is there a gap there? Is there a resourcing issue? If you literally can't drive or you can't afford to move to a different part of the country where your business has opportunities, that's going to be really hard. And then, so that's the person almost. Are they in a position to take opportunities? And then there's what you're doing as an organization. Have you built that ladder for them to be able to climb up? And it's getting all of those things in place and what employers can do to make sure they're in place for all their employees that is crucial. I guess my final point, because I think all of this is so important, is, with one of our companies we certainly worked with Compass, they've really challenged themselves on having no dead end jobs. So as an employer, they take on lots of people who have low skills, for example, for all sorts of reasons. They're doing lower paid initially, lower skill jobs, but actually as a business, they're really passionate about making sure people can climb the ladder. And they have worked out how you support someone who may be a woman, who I met one of their employees, senior manager now, started doing a bit of cleaning for a couple of days a week. The kids had just gone back to school. Now she's running a 900-person team that keeps one of our London hospitals going. If you'd if you talk to her about the career path when she first turned up for an interview, she probably would have not wanted to come back, and it would have been massively scary. But actually, that ability to genuinely, through each step of a career, an accidental career, get the confidence, get the support, be able to get the advice, to be able to then succeed, a bit more support when she was doing that next roll up, that actually was about the employer. And so there's a real question for all of the employers in our country is, are they really able to say there are no dead-end jobs? Can people really progress once they come through your door and start? Or are they getting more stuck? And that's why data matters, because the data can start to tell you perhaps where some sorts of people tend to get stuck, and then you can know where to look about what those barriers might be and remove them.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I love the phrase "no dead-end jobs," and I think that's a great mantra for employers to take on. Now, you mentioned the importance of data and measurement. And I have a particular question, which I have two questions. One is obviously, sometimes getting this data, and I constantly come across this in the, when I, for example, say to government or employers, you should get the data, they say, but it's collecting it is so tough. How do I get that data? So I'd love your view on, in your view, how should employers get that data? And then the second is just one, this is a constant debate we have on economic mobility, social mobility is, so what questions do you ask? Because you're right, it's not visible. So maybe those two questions and your thoughts on that.
So if people want to take steps on this, then they can obviously, and we'd love them to be part of what we've called the Equality of Opportunity Coalition. And it's these employers that are now challenging themselves on tracking. And we just started this work. We launched it towards the end of last year. But the whole point of it is we want to get lots of employers doing this together so that actually we can learn from one another. And the early learnings are that if you're just asking people socioeconomic questions and they don't understand why, then yeah, sometimes it can feel a bit intrusive. And of course, all of this stuff is done voluntarily, so no one has to answer any questions. But I think if the organization is really explaining that this is part of a broader push to make sure that it's an organization that is one that is helping drive social mobility, that is opening up opportunities for as many people as possible, then actually all the evidence that we're finding is people then understand that and they are much, much happier. So, for example, the Co-op has just done this really seriously for the first time, I think over literally 60,000 employees, and got really good response rates, but now has this amazing body of evidence that it can genuinely start to dig into. As for the questions, Anne, we do know what the questions are now. The Cabinet Office did a piece of work a few years ago looking at what those sorts of socioeconomic questions might be. The Social Mobility Commission, with help actually from my Social Mobility Pledge team and others, validated those questions. So there are 4 of them, almost 3 plus 1, 3 questions for all employees and recruits, and an extra question for graduates on universities. Those are the questions that we're asking. The first one is parental occupation at 14. And that's an important question because the way it's worded means it's using OECD occupations, and actually it holds out the prospect that if employers can at wide scale use this in the UK, we'll have this incredible evidence base that can be part of an international one. But what I really want to see on the socioeconomic measurement is the more employers that can ask these questions and build up their data sets, the more they'll get a sense of how they can improve being engines of social mobility. And what we want to do through this project is really then, in an anonymized fashion, obviously, pull together that data so that we can really get a sense of opportunity in the workplace and people's progression. And we've never, ever really been able to do that before. So I'm really excited about it. And if people do want to be part of it, then they should go on either the Social Mobility Pledge website, the Levelling Up Goals website, the Equality of Opportunity Coalition is part of that, and get in touch. We'd love to have everyone on board.
Great. Well, that's great, and they can find out more about those questions on there. And by the way, if you have a question for Justine, we will be taking questions later on in the broadcast. So please do put it into the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can toward the end. Well, okay, you've actually obviously been across a number of sectors, private sector, huge responsibilities in government, now in your campaigning work. What do you think we've collectively learned as a society from the pandemic about the importance of management and leadership? And what have you learned personally about your leadership style? And what do you think the government's learned from it?
So I think perhaps most fundamentally we've learned that if you want to get stuff done at scale, you have to work together. And so all of my experience in politics was it's very divisive. A lot of time is spent debating about differences, but and sometimes there's almost a dismissiveness of working collaboratively. But actually, the reality, and I saw this in international development, I saw it working with the teaching profession, is you get things done in teams. You get things done by working together. We got things done in COVID by not having massive structures, but fundamentally people saying, what's my role in helping to fix this? And brilliantly, businesses and employers did that too. I mean, I think that's what was so striking about COVID was genuinely you had businesses just think, well, where do we fit in? How do we take care of our employees? But actually, what can we do on top? And I think that was perhaps the first time you saw this much wider mindset around this sort of broader purpose of businesses in particular really play through. I felt it did show good and also weak leadership and management. Certainly, I felt like for me, with our team, I mean, we are totally mission driven. We know exactly what we're here to do. We want to drive social mobility. We want to create an ecosystem of lots of different people who are working with us to do that as well. But I felt that worked because what it meant was as we all worked remotely, everybody on the team already knew fundamentally what the whole point of this was. So they were able to work, and we were able to work remotely, I think, quite easily in a way. We did lots of team meetings, many, many more than normal. But I think that sense of purpose for us really helped. And I think as a result, sort of good managers who know what they're trying to accomplish with their teams and have communicated that, I think they were able to thrive. I think by contrast, weak managers that just use styles of say, because, do it because I've just told you, I think, that came much more unstuck. And I think if you look forward to a hybrid working environment in the future, it is going to mean that managers need to get and improve their styles and modernize in those cases, I would say. So I think for government as well, there was a sense that, it's not all about policy. And for these big national challenges, government is part of that ecosystem, but actually there are other parts that you needed to mobilize to tackle COVID. And that's the same with net zero and the planet. It's going to be the same on leveling up and people. Government, I'd have done it. If I could have put a pot of money in there that would have fixed it, I'd have done it. If I could have passed a law, I'd have done it. And I think what government is learning is that it needs to be able to have, I suppose, some sense of a broader mission that others can be part of. But with that requires a sort of moral authority almost to be able to ask people to come with you on a journey on change, particularly on something like leveling up, because it's a good thing. And although I think it's good for businesses, I think for me, the work we're doing is about saying whatever else is happening in the wider ecosystem or in government, actually, we should be doing this because it's the right thing to do. I think it's the smart thing to do. But actually, the rest of the ecosystem that we're all part of should feel totally empowered to drive change. in a wider country for the better. And we shouldn't just see it as something that is for people who are in politics or in government. We can all have a really positive impact. And I think COVID was one of those times when we saw that very, very practically. And I hope that we hang on to that sense of feeling like we can all make a difference in our communities through what we do in our organizations.
Yeah, so a lot of the lessons you've talked about previously apply to government. Work collaboratively, get people involved, right? And let them understand their particular role. And it's also about delivery, isn't it? Right. So those are some pretty salient lessons that that obviously work for you across the piece. And I think, we'd certainly agree with them. Now, you mentioned at the outset the importance of mentoring for you and for those looking for opportunities in their careers. But what about sponsorship? Were you sponsored in your career? And if so, did that make a difference? And and who inspired you as a leader?
I think I wouldn't say I had lots of mentors, so there wasn't really that person that I could sort of always go back to. And I think partly that was because, as for lots of people, I changed companies, I changed jobs, I changed countries as well. I spent time working in Switzerland for a while when I was at Price Waterhouse. So I think this is the challenge almost with mentoring, is at the particularly at the beginning of careers, it's really bitty as you're sort of, quite quickly developing and switching around. And then of course in politics, it is a team game actually. But there's a lot of forces that make it very individualized. You all have your own constituency. So it's almost like you're kind of running your own bit, and you've got to be quite entrepreneurial. So there isn't always that hard and fast mentoring that I think would probably benefit, a lot of people who are in politics. But I do think there were times when I had sponsors, people who were there maybe I remember, my boss at SmithKline and then our VP of finance there saying they felt I should do an MBA. I'd not thought of doing one. But clearly I was probably showing that I was frustrated. I wanted to challenge myself more. And that's a really good example of where there were two people who gave me some ideas of what that might look like and then supported me to be able to get that sponsorship.
That's classic sponsorship.
A political career that I hadn't really planned at all has steadily happened. I think there were people who, were willing to give me a chance in some of those ministerial roles, which I'll always be grateful for.
Well, that's great. So it is important. Before we get to the questions, just in sum, I just have two thoughts or questions for you. What does a better, fairer society look like for you? And what's your one piece of advice about the impact all of the people working so hard in government, imagine all those people in your departments. What one piece of advice would you give to them?
Oh, God. So in terms of a better, fairer society, it'd be no surprise that my answer is one that has equality of opportunity. I don't think this country has ever had it. I think it's crucial to having a fairer society. I also think it's crucial to a better society. I think it's one that will feel like we all have a common shot at success. I think it can make for a better economy, better politics, better everything, frankly. So, and it's not a zero-sum game. It's not like if I get that opportunity now, someone else doesn't. More people with more opportunities, how we create more opportunities. It means more businesses. It means more opportunity and more prosperity. So equality of opportunity is the most important thing, other than net zero, that we need to achieve, certainly here in the UK. Advice for government, I don't know. Probably something around the fact that, it doesn't matter how compelling the vision is. You've got to have a strategy and a plan to implement, and the right people to be able to do it. it's not necessarily fancy, but having people, processes, systems in place to deliver is crucial. Otherwise, you can win elections with a brilliant vision, but then if you don't get to deliver it, you don't get to do what you really wanted, which was to change lives for the better and change the country for the better. So yeah, it would be get into those nuts and bolts. And if you need different people, get different people. If you need different skills, make sure you got them, and get into the detail. Delivery is everything.
So some great advice there, and obviously it resonates very strongly with us at CMI. And obviously equality of opportunity is what our 75th anniversary is focusing on. So we're right with you there. And that does mean we have to get stuff done and hopefully get it done together. Thank you so much, Justine, for your candor and your very insightful and wise words. We're going to get to some questions now. And our first question is from Matthew. What do you think about the U.S. terminology, first-generation professionals? This frames the conversation about socioeconomic background differently, and I wonder if you find it useful.
I've not, Matthew, really, really interesting question, actually. I've not come across that phrase before. I can get a sense of what it probably means, though, which is interesting. I'm probably a first-generation professional. I would be. And I think it's really, I think starting to get into how we break down that career path and how we might measure it and the sorts of questions we might ask people to understand where they're coming from is really interesting. And the only other thing I would say as a thought on all of this is, I think what's come out to me with a lot of my work on social mobility that I've sort of steadily it's almost like putting glasses on and the lenses have got ever clearer as I've dug into it more. Is there are some transition points, and it's managing those transition points in careers that really, really matter. And I think we've understood that in terms of people's earlier lives, like early years going into schools. We've understood schools to perhaps college or university. We've understood getting into a career really matters. I don't think we've understood how important some of those transition points are in people's careers. And it may
be, for example, like which transition points?
Well, for example, the first time you're running a team, the first time you're managing actually quite a lot of people rather than just a team, the first time you are running the whole thing. You know, I remember becoming a Secretary of State, and it was a massive step up from being a minister. And so I absolutely felt the difference in responsibility between being part of a small ministerial team in Treasury compared to being the Secretary of State of that department, full stop. And I think all of those transition points are risk moments where you can either manage them effectively and have help to do that and make right decisions and go in the right direction, or not. And I think the reality is, for a first generation professional, we should know that they're probably going to find that more of a challenge perhaps than others, not because they don't have the potential to do it, but just because they perhaps haven't seen others do it as much as other people in those situations might. So yeah, there's tons to get into in all of this, but I think it underlines just how much of an impact employers can have and managers can have if they're able to build up an expertise on helping the people that are part of their teams do this well. And I think over time, because this becomes an increasingly important part of how we know companies and organizations are successful, for managers wanting to make their own way in their careers, being able to demonstrate that you have a skill set in doing this, that I think starts to become much, much more important going forward.
Well, that's absolutely music to our ears, because of course that's CMI's mission, is to help all those managers and leaders in those transition points, those accidental managers, develop the skills, develop the confidence, develop the techniques, and be able to, you know, manage that team or lead that department and get those vital results. So we agree with you completely. It's an under-recognized challenge And it's incredibly important that people do, get equipped to do that well, because it makes a huge difference for everybody.
Yeah, and sometimes it's hard for people, but I remember, when I first started running a team, this is an industry, I just decided I would try and be the boss that I'd always wanted, but not had, or not necessarily had, or I'd maybe be the best bits of try and bring together all the best things, but just literally, even if you haven't had great bosses or whatever, or you don't really know how people do what you think you'd have liked your boss manager to be doing when you were in a team. And that's probably a good place to start, even if you're not sure. And I think, often trust your instincts, that there is a lot of advice out there, but fundamentally it's just about dealing with people decently and how you'd like to be dealt with yourself, and giving people a chance to shine, and trying to work out what they need to do to be at the best version of themselves, to be at the best.
Yeah, no, that is absolutely great advice. So next question is from Angela. What do you think the most important things to consider are when trying to transform the culture of an organization? Easy question.
Quite a big question. I think you've got to get a sense of almost how the organization ticks today, so where it's coming from. So I can think of one department I ran that had a management style that was exceptionally command and control. Don't ask me. I know what I'm doing. You need to just be telling me when it's done. And in fact, I don't actually necessarily want to hear if there are problems, just go away and fix them. And so, certainly one of those organizations, I remember thinking my style was completely different to that. And so just even getting that transition needed a body of work to be done to get people to shift. I can think of another department I ran where I knew we were all there for the same reason on day one. And so there wasn't really that need to kind of do the emotional connection because it was already there. It was just a very different kind of change process. So in terms of changing culture, it's about assessing where you're at today and why, and then working out what you think it needs to be like to really thrive going forward, but also how you're going to talk to the staff about that, and being realistic. I think, often staff just get told it's all going to get better, and they're like, yeah, I've heard this one before. So I think just a humility around how you're going to deliver that and how everyone's going to be part of delivering that change really, really matters. And there was one organization or one department I came to where there'd been a change process and it just hadn't really stuck. And so I didn't want to pretend coming into that department that we were going to do some change and now it was all going to get better, even though the last hadn't. So we were really clear cut about the sort of early attempt just hadn't really quite taken off, and our assessment of why, and we talked to staff about that, and before trying to do it properly that time. But yeah, it's difficult, and it takes some, I think, skill and judgment, but it has to come from a place of genuineness. I think if what you're trying to put in place is a culture that doesn't really work for you as the leader, then that's going to feel wrong to the staff. So you've sort of got to go with your style a little bit as well.
Yeah, and be, like you say, be authentic. And it sounds like you're saying also admit mistakes, like, oh, well, we got this wrong, this change process didn't work, so we're not going to pretend it did.
Yeah, and actually the feedback matters, and you learn from mistakes. So if you want to be an organization that runs towards problems and says, actually, things will go wrong, the key is, have we learned from them? And certainly, the change process in DFID came from a project that went really wrong. And after we'd fixed it, the big question in my mind that I asked the whole organization was, what is it about us that didn't mean somebody ran towards this before? And so it came from a negative, but what I wanted to say was we can get some huge positives out of this if we work out how we create a version of ourselves that mean we not only feel accountable, but can be as well. So there were lots of reasons why people had found it hard to sort that problem out. And I wanted to remove those barriers that I felt would have made being on the ground doing those sorts of projects really frustrating at times for people, not empowered to take obvious decisions to course correct when they must have known they wanted to. So I just think even then you can take a negative and say, right, okay, we are where we are, but how do we make this better as a result of this mistake? And if you can get those positives from those situations, then actually it's a very different kind of place that I think everybody's working in, including, you, if you're lucky enough and privileged enough to be that person who's the ultimate decision maker in a sense at the top.
Yeah, and really that's what you're saying in answer to the question. That's how you transformed that culture. So so it sounds like a great example. So our next question is from Trevor. Do you think having a military background or voluntary mission, e.g. AmeriCorps, can be an advantage in learning roles and accepting work culture? You may not have heard of AmeriCorps, but it's obviously a cadre of volunteers that are working to help with social issues. But just a voluntary background or a military background, is that an advantage in your book on learning roles and accepting work culture?
I think certainly in my experience, especially as a Secretary of State, when I was at international development, the US and the UK partnered to tackle Ebola. And so the US was leading on the Liberia work and partnering with Liberia, and we were partnering with Sierra Leone. But a big part of that response that we put together with Sierra Leone on the ground was the military. And I think what I really learned very firsthand then was just how brilliant the military can be on bringing alive this sense of a clear purpose, a clear mission, as it were, but then the logistics and the organization on how you do it, and people understanding their roles and why they matter and all of that. And so I think that insight is really important. I think as for volunteering, I just think people in any organization with a wider mindset of how all of this that you're doing day to day at work, quote unquote, fits in with the wider world, I think that's a really good thing. And I think the days of almost walking through a door into an office or logging on, increasing at home, and compartmentalizing our lives like perhaps we often used to do, I think those days have gone now. I don't feel like I'm a different person at work to the one that does get involved with a lot of community stuff. And I want to be able to bring me, as it were, to work. And I think a lot of employees and leaders feel like that. And actually, one of the things, there's lots of stuff I've really loved about doing all this social mobility work. But one of them is seeing, I think, a growing number of business leaders and employer leaders, as it were, feeling like they do have the permission to have a wider impact, and they can, with their employees, really achieve even more if they want to do that. And actually, as people found in COVID, the rest of the wider world loves it when they see organizations pitching in and helping. They really welcome it. And so I do think it's, the volunteering piece, I think, can really bring alive, if you like, those wider values that people bring into the organizations as well.
Absolutely, and you learn from it. All right, our very last question, it's a good one from Carlos. With the benefit of hindsight, is there one decision you wish you didn't make in your career?
In my career, oh my God, that's a brilliant one decision I wish I hadn't made. God, I've never really thought about that before, because I'm very much I sort of think you make calls and you get on with things. And I also think you learn from stuff that goes wrong, as well as probably more from stuff that goes wrong than stuff that goes right. Is there one decision? I think I can think of one role where I was quite junior, and I wish I'd been more proactive. I wish I'd not decided to just get on with my job. I wish I'd decided to, maybe reach out more and take more initiative.
Maybe speak up and challenge a little.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. But then I think that partly that I think that's about also maybe the culture I was working in didn't necessarily make me feel like that would be welcome if I did it. So I'm not going to beat myself too much up about it.
No.
Carlos,
Please don't. Please don't, Justine. You've had a fabulously successful career, made a huge impact, continuing, I would say, to make a huge impact in the work.
I'm not done at all.
Not at all. It sounds to me like you're really just getting started. And look at all you've accomplished thus far. So thank you so much for joining us on CMI 75th Leading Lights and sharing your brilliant insights and experiences with us. We've all really benefited. And if you've enjoyed today's discussion and you're not a member or friend of CMI and you want to find out more about how to join us, just click on the link in the chat. Thank you. Thank you to Justine, and have a wonderful rest of day. Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.